The telegram in Caleb Rowland's pocket promised a woman named Margaret Harper, refined, educated, ready to be his wife. The woman stepping off the Montana-bound train in 1877 was someone else entirely. Wrong face, wrong name, wrong everything. His money, 3 months' earnings, already gone, spent by a desperate family back east. She called herself Evelyn, Margaret's older sister, and she had nowhere else to go. "Give me 3 months," she said, chin lifted despite the fear in her eyes. "I'll work off every cent." He should have refused, should have put her back on that train, but something in her steady gaze made him say the one word that would change everything. "Fine." Welcome to a story of mistakes that became destiny. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I love seeing how far these tales travel. Now settle in, because this is the story of how the wrong woman became exactly right. The Montana wind carried dust and judgment in equal measure. Evelyn Harper stood on the platform of Garrison Station with her carpet bag clutched in both hands, watching a man approach through the afternoon haze. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hat pulled low against the sun, he walked like someone who'd forgotten how to hurry, or stopped caring. She knew immediately he was Caleb Rowland, the rancher. The man who'd paid good money for a bride named Margaret. The man whose money Evelyn had stolen. Her fingers tightened on the bag's worn handles. Behind her, the train released a long exhale of steam, and she fought the urge to climb back aboard. To run. To disappear into the landscape the way she'd disappeared from Boston, without explanation, without apology, without looking back. But there was nowhere left to run. Margaret Harper? His voice was rough, like gravel under wagon wheels. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see his face beneath the hat brim. Hard lines, sun-weathered skin, eyes the color of winter sky, already narrowing with suspicion. Evelyn swallowed. "No." The word hung between them. "No?" He pushed the hat back slightly, and those cold eyes traveled over her face, her plain traveling dress, her sensible boots, looking for something, not finding it. "You're not Margaret Harper." "I'm Evelyn Harper, Margaret's sister." The silence that followed had weight. Around them, the station continued its business, a freight handler shouting orders, a woman herding children toward a waiting wagon, the train preparing for departure. Normal sounds. A normal day. Except nothing about this moment was normal, and they both knew it. "Where's Margaret?" Caleb's voice had gone flat. "Philadelphia. She married a clerk there, 3 weeks ago." 3 weeks. He repeated it slowly, like he was translating from a foreign language. "And you're here instead?" "Yes. With my money." It wasn't a question. Evelyn forced herself to hold his gaze, even as shame burned in her chest. "The money was used. Our father had debts. If they weren't paid, he would have gone to prison. Margaret's wedding—" She stopped, reset. "The money's gone, Mr. Rowland. I can't give it back." Something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly. Worse. A kind of resignation that suggested he'd expected disappointment all along, and here it was, right on schedule. "So Margaret sent you to take her place." His tone made it clear what he thought of that arrangement. "Margaret didn't send me. I came on my own." Evelyn's spine straightened. "I'm here to work off the debt. Give me 3 months. I'll earn back what you paid, every cent, and then I'll leave." "Work." He said it like she'd suggested sprouting wings. "Doing what?" "Whatever needs doing. I can cook, clean, mend, manage accounts. I'm strong, I don't complain, and I keep my word." Caleb studied her for a long moment. She could see him measuring, calculating, deciding whether she was worth the trouble or just another problem in a life that clearly had enough of them. "You know what people will say," he said finally. "Woman living on a man's property, no marriage between them." "I know." "You know, and you're still asking." "I'm not asking, Mr. Rowland. I'm offering terms. 3 months of honest work for a debt honestly owed. If that damages your reputation, I apologize. But I have no other options." The train whistle blew, sharp and final. Last call. Evelyn felt it in her bones. The weight of that sound, the closing of doors, the narrowing of possibilities. Caleb looked past her at the train, then back at her face. Whatever he saw there made him sigh, a long breath that seemed to carry years of weariness. "Fine," he said. 3 months. You work, you keep quiet, you stay out of trouble. After that, we're square." Relief nearly buckled Evelyn's knees. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Don't." He reached for her bag. "You haven't seen the ranch." The wagon ride took an hour. Caleb didn't speak except to identify landmarks. The Miller property, the creek that ran dry every August, the pass where wolves sometimes came down in winter. His voice carried no warmth, no welcome, just information delivered in flat statements, like he was reading from a ledger. Evelyn didn't mind the silence. It gave her time to study the landscape. This place that would be her prison and salvation for the next 3 months. Montana was nothing like Boston. No buildings pressing close, no cobblestones or church bells or the constant hum of city life. Here, the land rolled away in every direction, grassland and sky meeting at horizons so distant they seemed imaginary. The air smelled of sage and dust, and something else, something wild she couldn't name. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. "You ever lived outside a city?" Caleb asked suddenly. "No." "You know anything about ranching?" "No." "Cattle? Horses?" "No." He made a sound that might have been a laugh or a curse. "This is going to be a disaster." Evelyn turned to look at him properly. In profile, his face was all angles, sharp jaw, straight nose, the kind of features that looked carved rather than born. Handsome, she supposed, if you liked that severe type. But there was something else there too, visible in the tight line of his mouth. Disappointment. Not just with her, but with something deeper. "Mr. Rowland," she said carefully, "what exactly were you expecting from Margaret?" "A partner." The word came quick and hard. "Someone who could help run a ranch. Someone practical." "And you thought Margaret was practical?" "Her letters said—" He stopped, jaw working. "Her letters described someone who wanted a simple life, hard work, honest living, no fancy ideas." Evelyn almost laughed. Margaret, who'd spent every spare penny on French perfume and silk stockings. Margaret, who'd fainted at the sight of their neighbor's bloody nose. Margaret, practical. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "My sister is many things, but practical isn't one of them." "And you are?" "I am." She met his skeptical glance with steady certainty. "I kept our household running after Mother died. I managed Father's accounts until he drank them dry. I know how to work, Mr. Rowland. I know how to survive. That's more useful than fancy letters." Something flickered in his expression, surprise maybe, or reluctant respect, but he only shook his head and turned back to the road. They crested a low hill and Evelyn saw the ranch for the first time. It sat in a shallow valley, protected from the worst winds by the surrounding rises. The house was simple, weathered wood, a stone chimney, a porch that sagged slightly on one side. Behind it stood a barn in better repair, a chicken coop, several corrals. Beyond those, grassland stretched toward distant mountains, dotted with shapes that must be cattle. It looked lonely. That was Evelyn's first thought, like a place that had given up trying to be more than functional. "Home," Caleb said, and the word held no pride. The inside of the house matched the outside, functional, worn, absent of anything soft. A main room served for cooking and eating, dominated by a stone fireplace and a table scarred by years of use. A door led to what must be Caleb's bedroom, another to a smaller room, empty except for a narrow bed frame and a broken chair. "That's yours," Caleb said, nodding toward the small room. "There's a mattress in the barn. I'll bring it in." Evelyn set her bag down and looked around. Dust layered every surface. The windows were clouded with grime. The fireplace was choked with old ash. The floor, when had it last seen a broom? "How long have you lived alone?" she asked. 2 years, since my brother left." "And before that?" "Before that, my mother managed the house." His voice flattened further. "She died 3 years ago." Understanding settled in Evelyn's chest. A man alone trying to run a ranch and maintain a home, failing at the latter because all his energy went to the former. It wasn't neglect, it was triage. "I'll start here," she said. "Get the house in order first." You'll start with learning to ride. Caleb was already moving toward the door. Can't work a ranch from inside a kitchen. Mr. Rowland. Caleb. He turned back, and for the first time something almost human crossed his face. If you're going to be here 3 months, you might as well use my name. Caleb, then. Evelyn drew a breath. I appreciate the practicality, but I can be more useful here first. This house doesn't pay bills. Cattle do. He pulled his hat lower. Dawn tomorrow. I'll teach you to ride. After that, we'll see what you're actually worth. He left before she could argue. Evelyn stood alone in the dim, dusty room and let reality settle around her shoulders like a yoke. 3 months. 90 days to prove she wasn't useless, wasn't a burden, wasn't the mistake everyone already assumed she was. She could do this. She had to do this. There was nowhere else to go. That night, Evelyn learned what silence really meant. In Boston, quiet was relative. Even at midnight, the city hummed. Distant voices, horses on cobblestones, the occasional drunk stumbling home. Here, silence was absolute. The kind of quiet that pressed against your ears until you heard your own heartbeat. She lay on the mattress Caleb had brought in, thin, lumpy, smelling of hay, and stared at the ceiling beams barely visible in the darkness. Through the thin wall, she could hear him moving in his own room. Heavy footsteps, the creak of a bed taking his weight. Then nothing. Did he regret his choice already? He must. Any sensible man would have put her back on that train, sent her away with nothing, let her face the consequences of her theft alone. But he hadn't. Why? Evelyn closed her eyes and tried not to think about the look on her father's face when she'd taken Margaret's place at the station. The relief, quickly masked. The shame he couldn't quite hide. He'd taken the money meant for his youngest daughter's future and gambled it away. And rather than face prison, he'd let his oldest daughter pay the price. You're doing the right thing, he'd said as the train pulled in. Margaret deserves her happiness. And what do I deserve? Evelyn had wanted to ask. But she already knew the answer, nothing. She deserved nothing because she'd never been the beautiful one, the charming one, the daughter who could catch a clerk's eye and secure her own future. She was the practical one, the invisible one, the one who cleaned up everyone else's mistakes. Well, this was her mess now, hers to fix. She pulled the thin blanket higher and tried to sleep. Dawn came cold and blue. Evelyn woke to the sound of a rooster and stumbled from bed, disoriented by the unfamiliar room, the unfamiliar sounds. She dressed quickly in the same travel clothes from yesterday. She'd need to do laundry soon, and emerged to find Caleb already up, feeding a fire in the main room's hearth. Coffee's ready, he said, without turning around. Drink fast, we've got work. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint. Evelyn drank it anyway, grateful for the warmth spreading through her chest. Ever been on a horse? Caleb asked. A carriage horse. In the city. That's not the same. He finally looked at her, and in the early light, his eyes seemed less cold, just tired. You're going to fall, probably more than once. Try not to break anything important. 15 minutes later, Evelyn stood in the corral, staring up at a horse that seemed impossibly tall. This is Ash, Caleb said, one hand on the mare's neck. She's gentle. Good for learning. Gentle was relative. The horse shifted its weight, and Evelyn took an involuntary step back. You scared? Caleb's voice held something that might have been amusement. Cautious, Evelyn corrected. There's a difference. In my experience, cautious people don't travel 1,000 miles to work off their sister's debt. In my experience, Mr. Rowland, Caleb, she amended. In my experience, desperate people do all sorts of things that look like courage, but are really just survival. That got his attention. He studied her across the horse's back, and Evelyn had the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen for the first time since she'd arrived. Fair enough, he said finally. Now, get on the horse. The next hour was humiliation. Evelyn fell twice trying to mount. Once she managed to get into the saddle, only to slide off the other side. When she finally stayed mounted, the horse walked 3 steps, and she lurched forward, grabbing the saddle horn with both hands while Caleb barked instructions that made no sense. Heels down, back straight. Don't grip with your knees, you'll just tire yourself out. Feel the horse's movement. Move with her, not against her. Easy for him to say. He moved like he'd been born on horseback, fluid and natural. Meanwhile, Evelyn felt like a sack of grain poorly balanced and likely to split. But she didn't quit. Every time she fell, she got back up. Every time the horse moved in a way she didn't expect, she adjusted. By the time the sun had climbed to mid-morning, she could walk Ash around the corral without falling off. Good enough, Caleb said. He looked surprised, like he'd expected her to give up hours ago. Tomorrow we'll work on trotting. Evelyn climbed down, legs shaking, and tried not to show how much everything hurt. You did better than I expected, Caleb admitted as they led Ash back to the barn. What did you expect? Tears, complaints, demands to go back inside where it's safe. Evelyn ran a hand along Ash's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal, the solid reality of muscle and bone. I told you, Mr. Rowland, I don't complain, and I keep my word. It's Caleb. He took Ash's reins from her. And I'm starting to believe you, Sam. The days developed a rhythm. Dawn riding lessons, brutal and exhausting. Then Evelyn would work on the house while Caleb rode out to check fences, move cattle, handle the 1,000 tasks a ranch required. She'd clean, cook simple meals from the limited supplies in the larder, mend clothes she found stuffed in a trunk. The work was endless, but it was honest. It had purpose. In the evenings, they'd eat in silence, both too tired for conversation. Caleb would review account books by lamplight, while Evelyn mended or planned the next day's tasks. Then sleep, heavy and dreamless, until dawn started it all over again. By the end of the first week, Evelyn could ride well enough to accompany Caleb on short trips around the property. By the end of the second week, she was helping with actual ranch work, mending fence, moving cattle from one pasture to another, learning to read the land the way Caleb did. See how the grass is shorter there? He'd point out. Means the cattle are spending too much time in that section. We need to move them. Why not let them graze where they want? Because they'll overgraze, destroy the pasture, and we'll have nothing for winter. He said it without condescension, just stating facts. Ranching isn't about letting nature take its course. It's about working with nature to make something sustainable. Evelyn found herself taking mental notes. Not because she planned to stay, she didn't, but because the logic of it fascinated her. The way everything connected, how a decision made in spring affected outcomes in winter, how the land itself was a partner in the enterprise, requiring attention and respect. You're good at this, Caleb said one afternoon. They were checking a fence line, and Evelyn had spotted a weak post before he had. At what? Seeing what needs doing. Most people wait to be told. Most people didn't grow up managing a household falling apart. Evelyn tested the post with her hand, confirming it needed replacement. You learn to spot problems before they become disasters. Your father, Caleb hammered a support stake into the ground. The debts. That why Margaret left. It was the most personal question he'd asked. Evelyn considered deflecting, then decided honesty was simpler. Father liked cards more than responsibility. Mother's death made it worse. He'd gamble, lose, promise to stop, gamble again. Margaret saw which way things were heading and found herself an exit. Smart girl, I suppose. Evelyn held the post steady while Caleb secured it. Though if she'd been truly smart, she would have told you the truth instead of taking your money. Would you have? Caleb straightened, wiping sweat from his forehead. Told me? If you were her? I wouldn't have accepted money for marriage in the first place. The words came out sharper than intended. Seems like a poor foundation. And yet you're here, working off that exact transaction. That's different. I'm repaying a debt, not selling myself. Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a tightness around his eyes. You think that's what I was doing? Buying a woman? I think you paid money expecting a wife. What would you call it? Practical. He gathered the tools with hard, precise movements. I need help running this ranch. I don't have time to court someone, even if there were prospects nearby. A mail order arrangement made sense. And love? Evelyn asked. Where does that fit in your practical equation? Love is what got my mother broken. Caleb's voice went cold. She loved my father, followed him out here when this was barely civilized land. Worked herself to exhaustion trying to make him happy. And when he died, she just gave up. Like she'd only been alive because he was. He met Evelyn's eyes. I don't need that. Don't want it. A partner, respect, shared purpose, that's enough. Evelyn thought of her own mother, worn down by years of disappointment in a husband who kept promising to change. Thought of herself, invisible in her sister's shadow, practical because no one had ever seen her as anything else. Maybe you're right, she said quietly. Maybe practical is all any of us should hope for. They worked in silence after that, but something had shifted between them. An understanding, fragile and unnamed. The fourth week brought the first real crisis. Evelyn woke before dawn to the sound of frantic lowing. She stumbled from bed, still half asleep, and emerged to find Caleb already pulling on his boots. What's wrong? Cattle scattered. Sounds like something spooked them. He grabbed his rifle from above the door. Stay here. I can help. Okay. Stay here. His voice left no room for argument. Then he was gone, swallowed by the pre-dawn darkness. Evelyn waited exactly 5 minutes before following. She found him at the western pasture, cursing steadily. The fence was down, rails scattered like kindling, and the cattle, at least a dozen head, were gone. Wolves? Evelyn approached cautiously. Worse. Someone cut the fence. Caleb crouched, examining the clean breaks in the wire. This was deliberate. Who would? Doesn't matter right now. We need to find those cattle before they scatter completely, or predators find them. He stood, scanning the darkness. Can you ride in the dark? I can try. Good enough. Get Ash saddled. We're going after them. The next 4 hours tested every skill Evelyn had learned and several she invented on the spot. They tracked the scattered herd by moonlight and instinct, Caleb reading signs in the grass that Evelyn couldn't see. They found most of the cattle within 2 miles, bunched together and nervous. Herding them back was another challenge entirely. The animals didn't want to move in the direction Evelyn wanted, and she quickly learned that cattle had their own opinions about things. But Caleb talked her through it, how to position herself, how to use pressure and release, how to work with the herd's natural instincts rather than against them. By the time the sun rose, they had 11 of the 12 cattle back in a temporary corral. The last one was still missing. We'll look again after we secure the fence, Caleb said. He looked exhausted, face gray with fatigue. Good work out there. You kept your head. I was terrified the entire time. I know. He almost smiled. You did it anyway. That's what counts. They worked through the morning repairing the fence, and that's when the rider appeared. He came from the direction of town, a heavy man on a heavy horse, dressed too well for ranch work. He pulled up just outside the fence line and looked at them with the kind of smile that made Evelyn's skin crawl. Caleb Rowland, he called out. Heard you had some trouble last night. Caleb's whole body went rigid. Frank Miller, funny you should hear about it so fast. News travels in these parts, small community and all. Miller's eyes slid to Evelyn, taking in her dirt-stained dress, her loose hair. This the mail-order bride I heard about? Heard she wasn't quite what you ordered. Miss Harper is helping with the ranch. Caleb's voice could have frozen water. Not that it's your business. Everything that happens on neighboring properties is my business, Roland, especially when it involves fence lines and straying cattle. Miller leaned forward in his saddle. Found one of your cows on my land this morning. Thought you'd want her back. Where? Come by my place this afternoon. We can discuss terms for her return, and maybe talk about that fence of yours. Seems awful weak. Wouldn't want any more accidents. The threat hung in the air, obvious to everyone. Caleb's hand tightened on the fence rail. I'll be there at 2. Looking forward to it. Miller tipped his hat mockingly at Evelyn. Ma'am, pleasure seeing you. He rode off, and Evelyn watched Caleb's jaw work, fury barely contained. Who is he? She asked quietly. Owns the property east of here, been trying to buy me out for 2 years. Caleb drove a nail with more force than necessary. I won't sell, so he makes life difficult. He cut your fence. Can't prove it, but yes. What will you do? Get my cow back. Pay whatever ridiculous fee he asks. Fix the fence again. Caleb's voice was bitter with resignation. Same thing I always do. Evelyn studied him, this proud, stubborn man reduced to swallowing insults because he was alone, outnumbered, and fighting battles on too many fronts. Or, she said slowly, we could find a different solution. We? He turned to look at her. You hired me for 3 months of work, Mr. Rowland. You didn't specify what kind. Evelyn met his gaze steadily. Let me help, not just with cattle and fences, with this. Miss Harper. Evelyn, she interrupted, if I'm going to call you Caleb, you should use my name. Something passed between them then. Recognition, maybe, or the first thread of actual trust. Evelyn, he said carefully, what exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing we stop letting Frank Miller set the terms. She turned back to the fence. But first, we finish this repair. Then we plan. For the first time since she'd arrived, Caleb Rowland smiled, a real smile, small and surprised and almost hopeful. Yes, ma'am, he said, and together they got back to work. The afternoon sun beat down on the Miller property like a hammer on an anvil. Evelyn sat beside Caleb on the wagon seat, wearing her cleanest dress and a borrowed bonnet, playing a role they'd rehearsed during the 3-hour ride. She kept her spine straight, her hands folded, her expression pleasant and empty. Just another overlooked woman, decorative and harmless. Frank Miller was waiting on his porch, that same oily smile plastered across his face. Behind him, the ranch house sprawled, twice the size of Caleb's, fresh paint gleaming white in the sunlight. Money announcing itself in every board and nail. Rowland, Miller called out, and you brought the lady. How civilized. Caleb helped Evelyn down from the wagon with careful courtesy, and she didn't miss the way Miller's eyes tracked the movement, assessing, calculating what this woman meant to his neighbor. Mr. Miller, Evelyn said before Caleb could speak, how kind of you to recover our lost cow. The fence damage caused us such distress. Miller's smile widened. He liked this, a woman playing helpless, stroking his ego. Happy to help, ma'am. Though there is the matter of compensation. The cow was on my land, after all, eating my grass. Of course. Evelyn's voice stayed sweet. What do you think is fair? Well now, Miller settled back in his chair like a king on a throne. The animal was here for at least 12 hours. Grass doesn't grow on trees, if you take my meaning. I'd say $20 covers the inconvenience. Caleb went rigid beside her. $20 for 12 hours of grazing was highway robbery, and everyone knew it. Evelyn touched Caleb's arm lightly, a gesture that looked like wifely concern, but was really a warning. Let me handle this. $20, she repeated thoughtfully. That does seem substantial, but then you've been so neighborly. Perhaps we could offset some of that cost. Miller's eyebrows rose. How do you figure? Well, I noticed your fence line, the one bordering Caleb's property. Some of those posts look rather weathered. Wouldn't want any of your cattle wandering onto our land. We'd hate to have to charge you for the grass. She smiled, all innocence. Unless you'd prefer we simply help each other out when animals stray? No fees, just good neighbors? The silence that followed had teeth. Miller's smile froze. He looked at Evelyn like he was seeing her for the first time, reassessing everything he'd assumed. That fence is solid. I'm sure it is. Just thinking ahead. Evelyn's voice stayed pleasant, but her eyes were steel. You know how these things go. Weather changes, wood weakens. Better to have an understanding in place before problems arise. Miller's gaze shifted to Caleb, who had the good sense to keep his expression neutral. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it locked away. $5, Miller said finally, and we'll call it square. 3, Evelyn countered, plus our mutual agreement about wandering livestock. Neighborly assistance, no charges. Miller's jaw worked. He wasn't used to being negotiated with, especially not by a woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant, but he was boxed in and knew it. If he pushed too hard, he'd look petty. If he backed down completely, he'd look weak. Fine. The word came out like gravel. $3, get your cow and get off my property. Caleb paid without comment, and Miller had a ranch hand bring the missing cow from a rear pasture. The animal looked well-fed and completely unbothered by her adventure, which told Evelyn everything she needed to know about how accidentally she'd ended up on Miller's land. They were halfway back to the wagon when Miller called out, Miss Harper! He'd moved to the edge of his porch, arms crossed. You're a clever woman, surprising given your situation. My situation? Evelyn turned back, all polite inquiry. Working off your sister's debt, taking her place. That's the story, isn't it? Miller's smile had edges now. Must be difficult being second choice, being the one nobody wanted. The words landed like stones. Evelyn felt them hit, felt the old familiar shame try to rise in her chest. The story of her life. Unwanted, overlooked, the spare daughter sent to clean up someone else's mess. But she'd lived with that story for 26 years. It had lost its power to break her. Second choice implies there was a competition, Mr. Miller. Evelyn's voice stayed steady. I prefer to think of myself as a correction, the right person, arriving at the right time. But thank you for your concern. She climbed into the wagon before he could respond. Caleb said nothing until they were a mile down the road, the Miller ranch safely behind them. Then he started laughing, a rough, rusty sound like he'd forgotten how. You just called yourself a correction to his face. I called myself the right person, Evelyn corrected. The correction was implied. That was... Caleb shook his head, still grinning. You backed him into a corner using nothing but polite conversation. Where did you learn that? My mother used to host her husband's business associates, men who thought women were decorative and stupid. Evelyn adjusted her bonnet against the sun. She taught me that the best weapon is one they never see coming. Smile, be pleasant, and strike while they're still underestimating you. Remind me never to underestimate you. You already did, Mr. Rowland, the day I arrived. Caleb, he said automatically. Then, quieter. And you're right. I did underestimate you. Won't make that mistake again. They rode in comfortable silence, the recovered cow trailing behind on a lead rope. The afternoon stretched golden around them, and Evelyn felt something shift in her chest. Not quite contentment, she wasn't naive enough for that, but something close, purpose, maybe. The satisfaction of being useful, being seen, being for the first time in her life exactly enough. The feeling lasted until they crested the ridge overlooking Caleb's ranch and saw the smoke. Not the friendly smoke of a cooking fire. Black smoke billowing from the barn. Caleb swore and snapped the reins. The wagon lurched forward, rattling over the rough ground at dangerous speed. Evelyn gripped the seat, her heart hammering against her ribs as they careened down the slope. The barn was fully ablaze by the time they reached it. Caleb was off the wagon before it stopped moving, running toward the flames. Evelyn scrambled after him, already knowing what he was thinking. The horses, still in their stalls, and the winter hay stored in the loft. "We need water," Caleb shouted. "The well, get buckets." But Evelyn was already moving, not toward the well, but toward the barn door. She could hear the horses screaming, smell the acrid stench of burning wood and terror. "Evelyn, no!" Caleb grabbed her arm. "The structure's not stable. The horses will die." She jerked free. "I can get them out." She didn't wait for permission. The heat hit her like a wall as she yanked open the barn door, smoke pouring out in choking waves. She pulled her shawl over her mouth and plunged inside. The interior was chaos, flames crawling up the walls, hay smoldering in the loft, beams creaking ominously overhead. The two horses were in their stalls at the far end, eyes rolling white with panic. Evelyn ran. Her eyes watered, her lungs burned, but she kept moving. The first horse, Ash, gentle Ash, tried to rear when Evelyn reached for the stall latch. "Easy, girl, easy." Evelyn forced her voice calm despite the terror clawing at her throat. "We're leaving, right now." The latch stuck. Evelyn yanked harder, panic rising. Behind her, something crashed, a beam giving way. Sparks rained down. The latch gave. Ash bolted past her, a brown blur heading for daylight. Evelyn stumbled to the second stall, where Caleb's gelding thrashed against the walls. "Come on, come on!" Her fingers fumbled with the latch, slippery with sweat. The smoke was so thick now she could barely see. The heat was unbearable. The gelding erupted from the stall the moment she opened it, nearly trampling her in its desperation. Evelyn pressed against the wall, felt the animal's flank brush past, felt the rush of air as it galloped toward freedom. She turned to follow. The beam fell directly in her path. 1 second the exit was clear. The next, A burning timber blocked the way, flames licking upward, smoke billowing out in thick clouds. Evelyn staggered backward, coughing, her lungs screaming for clean air. Another exit. There had to be another way out. But the smoke was too thick. She couldn't see, couldn't breathe. Her knees buckled. Then hands grabbed her shoulders, strong and sure. Caleb hauled her upright, his face appearing through the smoke like salvation. He didn't speak, couldn't speak in the choking haze, just wrapped an arm around her waist and half carried, half dragged her toward a side door she hadn't seen. They burst into daylight together, stumbling away from the barn as another section of roof collapsed inward with a sound like thunder. Evelyn fell to her knees on the grass, coughing so hard she thought her ribs would crack. Caleb dropped beside her, both of them gasping, their faces black with soot. "You stupid—" Caleb broke off, coughing. "You could have died. The horses aren't worth your life." He grabbed her shoulders and his hands were shaking. "Nothing in that barn was worth your life. Do you understand me?" Evelyn looked at him, really looked. His face was stark with fear, not anger. Fear for her. When had anyone last been afraid for her? "I understand," she whispered, "but I couldn't let them burn." Caleb's grip loosened. He slumped back, running a hand over his face, leaving clean streaks in the soot. "Of course you couldn't, because you're—" He stopped, shook his head. "Never mind. You're safe. That's what matters." They sat together on the grass and watched the barn burn. There was nothing to be done. No amount of water could save it now. The structure was lost. The hay was lost. Weeks of stored supplies were lost. They could only watch and be grateful the house stood far enough away to be safe. As the sun set, painting the smoke orange and gold, Evelyn finally found her voice. "Miller did this." "Can't prove it." Caleb's voice was hollow. "We both know he did." Knowing and proving are different things. He picked up a handful of grass, let it fall through his fingers. "And even if we could prove it, what then? His ranch is bigger, his influence runs deeper. We go after him, we lose. So we do nothing? We survive." Caleb looked at her, and in his eyes she saw years of this. Years of swallowing injustice because fighting back would cost more than he could afford. "We rebuild. We keep going. That's all we can do." Evelyn thought about that. About survival as strategy. About how many times she'd made the same calculation in her own life. When to fight, when to bend, when to simply endure. But survival wasn't enough anymore. Not for her. Not after she'd spent 4 weeks learning that she was capable of more than endurance. "What if there was another way?" she asked quietly. Caleb gave her a sharp look. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that Frank Miller won't stop. He cut your fence. He burned your barn. What's next? The house? The cattle?" Evelyn brushed soot from her dress with hands that had stopped shaking. "You can't fight him alone. You need allies." "I don't have allies. I have neighbors who won't risk Miller's anger to help me." "Then we make new ones, or we make ourselves too difficult to destroy." Evelyn stood, her legs steady now despite everything. "You said you needed a partner, someone practical. Let me be that." "You are that. You proved it today." "No." Evelyn looked down at him, this proud, stubborn man who'd given her a chance when he had every reason not to. "Today I proved I can run into a burning barn. Tomorrow we prove I can help you save this ranch." Caleb stood slowly, studying her face in the dying light. "How?" "By making what Miller wants impossible to take." Evelyn's mind was already working, pieces clicking together. "He wants your land. He's been making your life miserable to force a sale. But what if you couldn't sell? What if the ranch wasn't just yours anymore?" Understanding dawned in Caleb's expression. "A marriage contract. A partnership contract. Legal and binding." Evelyn spoke carefully, making sure he understood exactly what she was proposing. "If we're married, the ranch belongs to both of us. Miller can't pressure you into selling without my agreement, and I have nothing to lose. No reputation in this town, no prospects elsewhere. I can be the difficult partner he can't intimidate." "You do that? Tie yourself legally to a failing ranch and a man you barely know?" "I do that to repay a debt and build something worth protecting." Evelyn held his gaze. Only if you want a real partner, Caleb. Not a mail-order bride, not a convenience, an equal. The silence stretched between them, heavy with possibility and risk. There would be talk, Caleb said finally, more than there already is. Let them talk. You'd be stuck here. 3 months becomes permanent. I have nowhere else to go. You know that. And if you meet someone, fall in love with a man who isn't just a practical arrangement? Evelyn almost laughed. I'm 26 years old, and I've never been anyone's first choice. I've made my peace with practical, Mr. Rowland. The question is whether you have. Caleb looked at the smoldering barn, then back at her. When he spoke, his voice was rough but certain. There's a circuit judge coming through Garrison next week. Does marriages, among other things. He extended his hand. If we're doing this, we do it right. Legal, witnessed, binding. Evelyn took his hand. His palm was calloused, his grip firm, real. Agreed, she said. They shook on it there in the failing light, with the barn collapsing behind them and the future uncertain before them. Not a romantic moment, not a declaration of love, just two practical people making a practical choice. It should have felt cold, calculated. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing Evelyn had done in years. That night, they made plans. The house was too quiet after the chaos of the fire, so they sat at the scarred kitchen table with the lamp burning low, discussing terms like business partners, which Evelyn supposed they were. We split decisions about the ranch, Caleb said, writing notes on a piece of paper. You handle the house and accounts. I handle the cattle and land management. Anything major, we discuss. Fair wages for my work, Evelyn added, separate from the marriage. I won't be dependent. Agreed. Same rate I'd pay a ranch hand plus room and board. And if it doesn't work, Evelyn hesitated. We should have a way out. After a year, if either of us wants to end it, we can. Caleb's pen stilled. You planning to leave in a year? I'm planning for honesty. You said you wanted that. Honesty if real feelings emerged. Well, honesty works both ways. If this arrangement becomes unbearable for either of us, we should have an exit. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. 1 year minimum, then we reassess. They worked through the details, sleeping arrangements, separate rooms, finances, shared account for ranch expenses, separate personal funds, public presentation, united front, no airing disagreements in town. It was the least romantic marriage planning in history. And yet, Evelyn found comfort in it. No false promises, no pretending this was something it wasn't, just two people building a foundation on truth instead of fantasy. One more thing, Caleb said as they finished. The town. People will assume things about why we're doing this, about what kind of relationship we have. Let them assume. Some of those assumptions will be ugly. You'll be called names. So will I. Evelyn thought of Frank Miller's words earlier. Second choice, the one nobody wanted. She'd lived with worse. I can handle ugly, Caleb. I've been handling it my whole life. Something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or kinship. I suppose you have. He stood, collecting the papers. Get some sleep. We've got a lot of work ahead. Caleb? Evelyn stopped him before he reached his door. Thank you. For today. For coming into that barn. You saved the horses first. I just made sure you made it out. He paused, his back to her. Don't do that again. Run into burning buildings. I meant what I said. Nothing's worth your life. Not even your horses? Not even them. He disappeared into his room, leaving Evelyn alone with the lamp and her thoughts. She should have been afraid. She was binding herself legally to a virtual stranger, tying her future to a struggling ranch in the middle of nowhere. No love, no security, just a shared enemy and mutual need. But as she extinguished the lamp and made her way to her own room, all Evelyn felt was determination. They would rebuild the barn. They would marry. They would show Frank Miller and everyone else that the wrong woman was exactly right for this fight. And maybe, if they were very lucky, they'd build something worth more than survival. Maybe they'd build a home. The week before the judge's arrival passed in a blur of work and smoke-scented determination. They cleared the barn debris, salvaged what they could, made plans for rebuilding once they had funds. Caleb rode to neighboring ranches, quietly spreading word that he'd be marrying his mail-order bride after all. The story was close enough to truth that nobody questioned it. Evelyn scrubbed soot from every surface, mended Caleb's good shirt, and tried not to think too hard about what she was about to do. On the morning of the 6th day, a rider appeared on the road, a young man on a tired horse, carrying a leather satchel marked with official seals. "You Caleb Rowland?" he called out. Caleb emerged from the temporary shelter they'd built for the horses. "I am. Got a summons for you, from Frank Miller. Says you owe him for damages caused by your livestock on his property. Court date set for 2 weeks." The paper the rider handed over was official, stamped, and completely fabricated. Evelyn read it over Caleb's shoulder and felt cold anger settle in her gut. "This is nonsense," she said. "We paid him for the 1 cow. There's been no other damage." "Don't matter what happened, ma'am. Matters what's written." The rider tipped his hat. "Judge'll sort it out." He rode off, leaving them with a legal summons and mounting dread. "He's not going to stop," Evelyn said quietly. "Is he?" "No." Caleb stared at the paper like it might burst into flames. "He'll keep coming until there's nothing left to take." "Then we don't give him the chance." Evelyn took the summons from his hands, folded it deliberately, tucked it into her apron pocket. "We marry tomorrow. We go to that court date as a united front, and we make sure Frank Miller understands exactly what he's up against." Caleb looked at her, this woman who'd been a stranger a month ago, who'd run into a burning barn without hesitation, who was now proposing to bind her life to his in the face of a fight they might not win. "You're certain?" he asked. "I've never been more certain of anything. Even though I can't promise we'll win, can't promise any of this will work?" "Caleb Rowland," Evelyn said, and her voice was steady as stone. "I didn't come all the way to Montana to back down from a fight. Did you really think I would?" For the first time since the barn burned, Caleb smiled. "No, ma'am, I suppose you wouldn't." "Then let's get married tomorrow and show that man what a real partnership looks like." They shook hands on it again, formal and businesslike. Neither of them noticed how long they held on or how natural it felt. Tomorrow they would marry. Tomorrow they would become partners in law as well as necessity. Tomorrow they would step into a battle that had been brewing since the day Evelyn arrived. But tonight they sat together in the gathering darkness and planned their strategy, 2 practical people building something impractical and stubborn and real. And if Evelyn's heart beat a little faster when Caleb's shoulder brushed hers over the papers, well, that was just nerves about the wedding. Nothing more. Nothing more at all. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and clear, with frost painting the grass silver and the sky the pale blue of forgetting. Evelyn woke before sunrise and lay in the narrow bed, listening to Caleb move around in the next room. Getting dressed, probably. Preparing for a day that would change everything and nothing at the same time. They'd still be the same people working the same ranch. Only the law would recognize what necessity had already made true. She rose and pulled on the only dress she owned that wasn't stained with soot or work, a simple gray cotton with black trim that she'd worn to her mother's funeral 3 years ago. Not exactly bridal, but then this wasn't exactly a wedding, not in any traditional sense. When she emerged, Caleb was waiting by the door in clean clothes, his hair still damp from washing. He looked at her dress, and something flickered across his face. "You should have something better," he said quietly. "For this. This is fine. It's practical." "Everything with you is practical." He crossed to a trunk in the corner, the one she'd seen but never opened. When he lifted the lid, she caught a glimpse of folded fabric before he pulled out a dress wrapped in muslin. "This was my mother's," Caleb said, handling it carefully. "She wore it when she married my father. It's been sitting in this trunk for 3 years, and she'd have wanted—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "You should wear something that means something, even if this is just an arrangement." Evelyn took the dress with gentle hands. The fabric was soft blue wool, well made and carefully preserved, the kind of dress a woman wore when she believed in new beginnings. "Caleb, I can't—" "You can, please." His voice went rough. "My mother would have liked you. She would have wanted you to have it." There was no arguing with that kind of offering. Evelyn retreated to her room and changed, her fingers trembling slightly as she fastened the buttons. The dress fit well enough. Caleb's mother had been a practical woman too, built for work rather than decoration. When Evelyn looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Not because the dress transformed her, but because for the first time in her life, she looked like she belonged somewhere, like she was worth something beautiful. She emerged to find Caleb staring out the window, shoulders tense. "Ready?" he asked, without turning around. "Ready." The ride into Garrison took 2 hours. They didn't speak much, both lost in their own thoughts. The wagon rattled over familiar roads, past the Miller property, where smoke rose lazily from the chimney, past other ranches where people were starting their day without the weight of legal binding settling on their shoulders. The town itself was small. A main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a modest building that served as courthouse, post office, an occasional meeting hall. Judge Crawford held sessions there once a month, handling everything from property disputes to marriages to the occasional criminal case. Today, he was marrying people. There was already a couple waiting when Caleb and Evelyn arrived. Young, barely 20, holding hands and whispering to each other with the kind of intimacy that made Evelyn look away. That's what weddings were supposed to be. Joy and promise and the foolish certainty that love would be enough. She and Caleb had no such illusions. "Mr. Rowland." Judge Crawford was a lean man with silver hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I heard about your barn. Terrible luck." "Luck had nothing to do with it," Caleb said evenly, "but we're managing." "I'm sure you are." Crawford's gaze moved to Evelyn, assessing. "And this must be Miss Harper, the mail-order bride who arrived under such interesting circumstances." So the whole town knew. Of course they did. In a place this small, secrets died before they were fully born. "I'm Evelyn Harper," she said clearly, "and I'm here to marry Caleb Rowland." "Voluntarily?" Crawford asked. It wasn't an idle question. His eyes held genuine concern, checking for coercion or desperation beyond the normal kind. "Voluntarily," Evelyn confirmed. "Completely." "Then we'll proceed after these two lovebirds finish." Crawford nodded toward the young couple. "Won't be long." They waited on a bench outside the office while the young couple took their vows. Through the thin walls, Evelyn could hear the traditional words, love, honor, cherish, till death, promises that sounded noble and terrifying in equal measure. "We don't have to do this," Caleb said quietly, "if you've changed your mind." "Have you?" "No. But I'm not the one giving up other options. You could still leave. Find someone who'd marry you for the right reasons." Evelyn turned to look at him properly. In the morning light, his face was all hard angles and doubt, like he couldn't quite believe she'd chosen this. "Caleb, do you remember what you told me about your mother? That she loved your father so much she couldn't survive without him?" "Yes." "That's what I'm avoiding. I don't want to be so lost in someone else that I disappear." She folded her hands in her lap, the blue dress soft under her fingers. "I want a partnership, mutual respect, shared purpose. You're offering exactly what I need. Why would I want anything else?" He studied her face for a long moment. "You're a strange woman, Evelyn Harper." "I prefer practical." "That too." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Guess we're well matched then." The young couple emerged, flushed and beaming, and Crawford called them in. The ceremony was brief and businesslike. Crawford read the necessary words from a worn book, asked the required questions, and had them sign the register with 2 witnesses pulled from the street, the shopkeeper's wife and a ranch hand in town for supplies. No music, no flowers, no pretense that this was anything but a legal transaction. "Do you, Caleb Rowland, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward?" "I do." "And do you, Evelyn Harper, take this man as your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward?" Evelyn looked at Caleb, at this man who'd given her a chance when he had every reason to turn her away, who'd run into a burning barn to save her, who was offering her a place to stand when she'd had nowhere left to fall. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I pronounce you husband and wife." Crawford closed the book with a snap. You may kiss the bride, if you're so inclined. Caleb's eyes met Evelyn's. A question, wordless. She nodded slightly. He leaned in and pressed his lips to hers, brief and chaste and somehow more honest than any passionate declaration. When he pulled back, something had shifted in his expression. Not love, they weren't fools enough for that yet, but commitment. The acknowledgement that they'd chosen this path together and would walk it to whatever end waited. Congratulations, Crawford said, though his tone suggested he had doubts about what they'd just done. I'll file the paperwork today. You're legally bound now, for better or worse. They paid the fee and stepped out into the morning sunlight as husband and wife. It felt surreal. Evelyn looked at the ring on her finger, a simple band Caleb had produced from his pocket, another item that had belonged to his mother, and tried to process that she was married. Actually married. 4 weeks ago, she'd been nobody, arriving in Montana under a cloud of shame and debt. Now she was Mrs. Caleb Rowland, co-owner of a struggling ranch and partner in a fight she'd chosen freely. We should get supplies before we head back, Caleb said, practical as ever. And let people know. Better they hear it from us than through gossip. They walked to the general store, and Evelyn could feel eyes tracking them, curtains twitching in windows, conversation stopping mid-sentence. The news would spread through town like wildfire. Caleb Rowland had actually married that woman, the wrong bride, the sister who'd stolen her sibling's place. Let them talk. Evelyn had stopped caring what people thought the moment she'd stepped off that train. The general store was run by a woman named Mrs. Chen, who'd come from California during the gold rush and stayed when her husband died. She looked up from her ledger when they entered, took in their formal clothes and the ring on Evelyn's finger, and smiled. Congratulations, she said, and meant it. I wondered if you two would make it official. Thank you, Mrs. Chen, Evelyn said. We need supplies, coffee, flour, salt, and lumber, Caleb added. For the barn. Whatever you can spare. Mrs. Chen's smile faded. I heard about that. Terrible thing. You know who did it? Can't prove anything. Caleb's voice was carefully neutral. Can't prove and know for certain are different things. Mrs. Chen began gathering supplies. Frank Miller's been a problem for a lot of people. Not just you. Others have had trouble? Evelyn asked. The Hendersons, 2 years back, lost half their cattle to a mysterious fence break. The widow Morrison, last spring, her well suddenly went bad right when Miller offered to buy her out. Mrs. Chen wrapped the flour in brown paper. He wants to own everything from here to the mountains, and he doesn't care who he has to break to get it. Has anyone stood up to him? Caleb asked. No one who's succeeded. He's got money, influence, and a mean streak wide as the Missouri, Mrs. Chen's eyes moved between them. But he's never gone up against a married couple before. Property laws are different when there's a wife involved. Harder to intimidate, harder to force a sale. That's what we're counting on, Evelyn said quietly. Mrs. Chen studied her for a moment, then nodded with what looked like approval. You're tougher than you look, Mrs. Rowland. Good. You'll need to be. They loaded the wagon with supplies and paid from the ranch account, which was now legally joint. The ledger showed the transaction under both their names, Caleb and Evelyn Rowland, partners in debt and determination. They were heading back to the wagon when a voice stopped them. Well, well, if it isn't the happy couple. Frank Miller stood outside the saloon, whiskey glass in hand despite the early hour. Behind him, 3 of his ranch hands lounged against the wall, watching with the kind of anticipation that preceded violence. Caleb's whole body went rigid, but Evelyn touched his arm lightly. Stay calm. Mr. Miller, she said pleasantly. What a surprise. Is it, though? Miller's smile was all teeth. I heard Rowland was getting married today. Wanted to offer my congratulations in person, though I have to say, it's a strange way to solve a barn problem. Marry the woman who was probably in on the burning. The accusation hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate. That's a serious claim, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. You got proof? Don't need proof to notice patterns. Woman arrives, ranch starts falling apart, convenient marriage follows. Miller shrugged. Just making observations? Then observe this. Evelyn stepped forward, and her voice could have cut glass. I'm Mrs. Rowland now, legal and binding. which means any problems you have with this ranch, you have with both of us. And I don't intimidate easy. Miller's eyes narrowed. That right? That's exactly right. You can burn buildings, cut fences, file false lawsuits. We'll rebuild, repair, and fight every single one in court. Because unlike you, we're not trying to steal what isn't ours. We're just trying to survive on land we own legally. She paused. But by all means, keep coming. We'll be here. The silence that followed was electric. Miller's face had gone dark, his knuckles white around the whiskey glass. His men shifted, waiting for orders. For a moment, Evelyn thought he might actually strike her. The violence was right there, visible in the tension of his shoulders. Then Caleb moved, placing himself slightly between them. Not aggressive, just present. A reminder that Evelyn wasn't alone. Miller saw it and laughed, sharp and bitter. You think you're so clever, don't you? Marrying to protect the property. But marriage won't save you from the court date next week. I've got witnesses who'll swear your cattle destroyed my fences and damaged my land. Damages will cost more than your little ranch is worth. Then I guess we'll see you in court, Caleb said evenly, and we'll let the judge decide who's telling the truth. Judge will decide what I pay him to decide. Miller drained his glass and threw it against the saloon wall where it shattered. You're finished, Roland. Both of you. You just don't know it yet. He stalked back into the saloon, his men following. The threat lingered in the air like smoke. Evelyn's hands were shaking, but she kept them steady until they were back in the wagon and out of town. Then she let out a breath that might have been a laugh or a sob. That went well, she said. Caleb looked at her like she'd lost her mind. He threatened us, directly, in front of witnesses. He did. And we didn't back down. Evelyn turned to face him. Caleb, he expected us to fold, to be scared. We weren't. You weren't. I was terrified he'd hurt you. But you didn't stop me from speaking. You stood with me, not in front of me. She touched the ring on her finger, still getting used to its presence. That's what partnership means. We face things together. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, the first time he'd done so since they'd left the courthouse. His grip was warm, solid. Together, he agreed. Whatever comes. They rode home in silence, hands linked across the wagon seat. Not romantic exactly, but real. Honest. The kind of connection built on respect rather than sentiment. When they crested the ridge overlooking the ranch, Evelyn saw it with new eyes. Not just Caleb's property anymore, hers too. Their shared investment, their shared fight, their home. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like permission to finally stop running. That night, they celebrated their marriage the way practical people did, by working. Caleb started sorting through the salvageable lumber from the barn, while Evelyn cooked an actual proper dinner using the supplies from town. Chicken stew with vegetables, fresh bread, even a jar of preserved peaches Mrs. Chen had tucked into their order with a knowing smile. They ate at the scarred kitchen table, and if it wasn't romantic, it was at least companionable. Comfortable, even. Like they'd been doing this for years instead of hours. Tell me about the court case, Evelyn said between bites. What exactly is Miller claiming? Caleb set down his spoon. He's saying our cattle broke through his fence, the one we know he cut himself, and damaged grazing land worth hundreds of dollars. He wants compensation plus court fees. But we paid him for the one cow already. This is different. He's claiming systematic damage over weeks. Says he's been documenting it. Documentation he fabricated. Evelyn's mind was already working. We need our own proof. Dates, fence inspection reports, anything that contradicts his timeline. I've got records of every fence repair I've done for the past 2 years, and the posts on his side of the property line are old, rotted. If they'd been properly maintained, no cattle could have broken through. Good. What else? They spent the next hour strategizing like generals planning a campaign. Evelyn made notes in careful handwriting, documenting everything they'd need for court. Caleb pulled out 2 years of ranch records, meticulous accounting that showed dates of repairs, costs, locations. Your bookkeeping is better than I expected, Evelyn said, scanning the ledgers. My mother's doing. She taught me that numbers don't lie, even when people do. Caleb leaned back, watching her work. You're good at this. Strategy, planning. Years of managing a household on shrinking funds teaches you to think ahead. She made another note. We should also get character witnesses, people who will vouch for your honesty. In this town, most people won't cross Miller. Mrs. Chen would. Caleb blinked. You think? She said Miller's been a problem for a lot of people. Maybe she's tired of it too. Evelyn tapped the pencil against the paper. And there have to be others. The Hendersons, the widow Morrison, people who've been hurt by him. Maybe they'll speak up if they know they're not alone. That's a lot of maybes. It's better than nothing. Evelyn met his eyes across the table. We have to try, Caleb. We can't just accept this. He studied her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. Not quite admiration, but close. When you walked into that burning barn, I thought you were reckless, foolish. I was both those things. But you were also brave, and now you're trying to walk into another kind of fire, fighting a man with more power and money and influence than we'll ever have. He shook his head slowly. You could have married someone safe, someone easy. Instead, you married me and inherited a war. I didn't inherit it, Caleb. I chose it. Evelyn's voice was steady. The same way I chose to get on that train to Montana. The same way I chose to ask for 3 months instead of running. I'm done letting other people make my choices for me. This is mine. We are mine. I'm not backing down. The silence that fell was different from the comfortable quiet of earlier. This was charged, heavy with things neither of them quite knew how to say. Finally, Caleb stood and crossed to where she sat. He held out his hand. Dance with me. Evelyn looked at his extended hand, then up at his face. There's no music. Does there need to be? She took his hand and let him pull her up. They stood in the small kitchen, barely swaying, with nothing but the crackle of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. It wasn't graceful. Evelyn didn't know how to dance properly, and Caleb was too stiff with years of solitude. But they moved together, finding a rhythm that belonged only to them. Why are you doing this? Evelyn asked quietly. Because we got married today, and you're wearing my mother's dress, and we should have at least one moment that isn't about survival. His hand was warm on her waist. Because you deserve that much. So do you. They swayed in the lamplight, two people who'd married for practical reasons discovering that practical didn't mean cold. It just meant honest, real, built on something more solid than fantasy. When they finally stopped, Caleb didn't immediately let go. Thank you, he said, for today, for saying yes, for being... He stopped, searching for words. For being exactly who you are. Evelyn's throat tightened. No one had ever thanked her for being herself. Usually they'd wanted her to be quieter, prettier, more like Margaret, less practical and more decorative. Thank you for seeing me, she managed. They stood there a moment longer, hands linked, the space between them charged with possibility. Then Caleb stepped back, clearing his throat. I should check the horses before bed, make sure the temporary shelter is secure. And I should finish these notes. They separated to their tasks, the moment broken, but not forgotten. Later, lying in bed in her small room, Evelyn stared at the ceiling and touched the ring on her finger. Mrs. Caleb Rowland. A name that felt strange and familiar at once, the identity built on choice rather than birth. Through the thin wall, she could hear Caleb moving in his room, getting ready for sleep. She wondered if he was thinking about the dance, about the court case, about the strange turn his life had taken when the wrong woman stepped off that train. She wondered if he regretted it. But then she remembered the way he'd looked at her across the table, the warmth of his hand on her waist, the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd said together, "Number." He didn't regret it, and neither did she. The next morning brought visitors. Evelyn was hanging laundry when she heard horses approaching, 3 riders coming up the road at an easy pace. She tensed, hand moving to the rifle they now kept propped by the door, but relaxed when she recognized Mrs. Chen on the lead horse. Mrs. Rowland, the shopkeeper called out. Hope we're not intruding? Caleb emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his pants. Mrs. Chen, what brings you out here? The 2 riders with her turned out to be John Henderson, a rancher from the eastern section, and Alice Morrison, the widow Miller had tried to force out. Both looked nervous but determined. We heard about the court case, Mrs. Chen said, dismounting. Thought you might need witnesses. Evelyn's heart jumped. You testify? About time someone stood up to Frank Miller, Henderson said. His face was weathered, his voice gruff. He cut my fences 2 years ago, cost me near 50 head of cattle. I couldn't prove it then, but I know it was him. He poisoned my well, Alice Morrison added quietly. She was younger than Evelyn expected, probably only 30, with tired eyes and work-roughened hands. Tried to force me to sell when my husband died. When I refused, suddenly my water went bad. Had to dig a new well, cost everything I'd saved. But you both kept your land, Caleb said. Barely. Henderson's jaw tightened. And only because we didn't have enough worth stealing. You've got good grazing, water access, and you border his property. He wants your land, Roland. He'll burn everything you own to get it. He already tried, Evelyn said. Our barn. The three visitors exchanged glances, unsurprised. We figured, Mrs. Chen said. That's why we're here. Miller's been terrorizing this area for years. Someone needs to stop him, and you two might actually have a chance. How do you figure? Caleb asked. Because you're not alone anymore. Because you married legal, which makes the property harder to take, and because, Mrs. Chen smiled slightly, because your wife has a spine made of iron and doesn't know when to back down. I watched her face Miller yesterday. That's not a woman who scares easy. Evelyn felt heat rise in her cheeks, but also something else. Pride, maybe. Recognition. Will you testify? She asked directly. In court, under oath? We will, Henderson confirmed. All three of us. We'll tell what Miller did to us. Establish a pattern. Make the judge see he's lying. He might retaliate, Caleb warned, against all of you. Let him try. Alice Morrison's voice was quiet but fierce. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of letting him win because we're all too scared to stand together. They spent the next hour reviewing what each person could testify to, documenting dates and damages. Mrs. Chen had kept meticulous records of suspicious purchases at her store. Miller buying large quantities of fence wire right before multiple accidental breaks, chemicals that could poison wells, lamp oil before mysterious fires. You've been tracking him, Evelyn said, awed. Someone had to. Mrs. Chen's smile was grim. My husband taught me to keep good records. Said you never know when information becomes evidence. By the time the visitors left, Evelyn and Caleb had a plan. Not foolproof, but real. A defense built on truth and testimony from people who'd finally found their courage. This might actually work, Caleb said, watching the riders disappear down the road. It has to work. Evelyn turned to face him. Because if it doesn't, Miller wins, and I refuse to let that happen. Caleb pulled her close. Not a kiss, just a brief embrace that spoke of solidarity and shared determination. When he released her, his eyes were bright. Then we'd better make sure we're ready. Court's in 4 days. They worked with renewed purpose, preparing their defense, gathering evidence, making sure every detail was documented. In the evenings, they practiced what they'd say, how they'd present their case. Caleb would state the facts, calm and measured. Evelyn would provide the context, the pattern of harassment, and their witnesses would tell the truth Miller had worked so hard to bury. It wasn't guaranteed to work. Miller had money and influence. He could bribe, threaten, manipulate. The system wasn't built to favor people like them. Ranchers scraping by, widows, women who'd arrived under scandalous circumstances. But they had something Miller didn't. They had each other. They had truth. And they had a stubbornness born of having nothing left to lose. On the third night, lying in bed, Evelyn heard Caleb moving around late. She rose and found him at the kitchen table, staring at papers by lamplight. Can't sleep? She asked. Thinking about tomorrow. About everything that could go wrong. Evelyn sat down across from him. We've done everything we can. I know, but if we lose, we won't lose. She said it with absolute certainty. Because we're right, and he's wrong, and sometimes that has to matter. You really believe that? I have to believe it. Otherwise, what's the point? She reached across the table and took his hand. We chose this, Caleb. Together. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it the same way. He squeezed her hand, and in his eyes she saw fear and hope tangled together. I'm glad you're here. Glad you got on that train, even if it was for all the wrong reasons. They weren't wrong, Evelyn said quietly. They just weren't what we expected. They sat together in the lamplight, hands linked across the table, two people who'd married for convenience discovering that convenience could grow into something deeper. Not love, not yet, but partnership, trust, the beginning of something that might, given time, become everything they'd never known they needed. Tomorrow they'd fight. Tonight, they'd hold on to this, the quiet certainty that they weren't alone, and that would have to be enough. The courthouse was already full when they arrived. Evelyn hadn't expected a crowd. This was supposed to be a simple property dispute, the kind of mundane legal matter that attracted no attention. But news had spread through the territory like wildfire. The mail-order bride who'd married under scandal was taking on Frank Miller. People had come from neighboring ranches, from town, even from as far as Helena. Some out of curiosity, some out of hope, and some, judging by the hostile faces near the front, out of loyalty to Miller. Judge Crawford sat behind his bench, looking irritated by the spectacle. Miller lounged at the plaintiff's table with a lawyer from Butte, expensive suit and confident smile broadcasting his certainty of victory. His three witnesses sat behind him, ranch hands who wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. Caleb and Evelyn took their seats at the defendant's table. No lawyer, they couldn't afford one. Just the two of them, their witnesses in the row behind, and a stack of ledgers and documents that represented 2 years of meticulous record-keeping. "This is quite the turnout," Crawford said dryly. "I'll remind everyone that this is a court of law, not a theater. Any disturbances and I'll clear the room." His gaze swept the crowd, landing briefly on Evelyn. "Mr. Miller, you're bringing the complaint. Present your case." Miller's lawyer stood, a portly man named Simmons with a voice like honey over gravel. "Thank you, Your Honor. We're here today because Mr. Rowland has shown flagrant disregard for property boundaries and the rights of his neighbors. Over the past 6 weeks, his cattle have repeatedly broken through fences onto Mr. Miller's land, causing extensive damage to grazing areas valued at over $300. Despite being notified of this problem, Mr. Rowland has refused to make restitution or take adequate measures to control his livestock." He presented a surveyor's map showing the boundary between the properties, photographs of damaged fence sections, and written estimates of the grazing damage. It all looked official, professional, damning. Then he called his first witness, one of Miller's ranch hands, a young man who testified that he'd personally seen Rowland cattle on Miller's land multiple times. The second witness confirmed it. The third added that he'd warned Caleb about the problem weeks ago and been ignored. All lies, delivered with the smooth confidence of men who'd been well paid and well rehearsed. Evelyn's hands clenched in her lap. Beside her, Caleb sat stone still, jaw tight, watching his reputation get torn apart by fabricated testimony. When Simmons finished, he smiled at the judge like a man who'd already won. "The evidence is clear, Your Honor. Mr. Rowland has been negligent, and my client deserves compensation for his losses." "Mr. Rowland," Crawford said. "Your response?" Caleb stood, and Evelyn saw his hands shake slightly before he steadied them. "Your Honor, every word of that testimony is false. My cattle never broke through to Miller's land except for one incident 6 weeks ago, which we immediately resolved and paid restitution for. The fence damage they're claiming? Miller cut those fences himself." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Miller's face went red. "That's a serious accusation," Crawford said. "Do you have proof?" "I have records." Caleb pulled out the first ledger. "Every fence repair I've done for 2 years, dated and documented. The sections they're claiming were broken by my cattle? Those same sections show repairs from storm damage, rot, and one incident of deliberate cutting on the night of September 14th, the same night someone burned my barn." "Coincidence," Simmons interjected smoothly. "And barn fires are unfortunately common on ranches." "Not when they're set deliberately," Evelyn said, standing. Her voice carried across the courtroom, clear and steady. "Your Honor, may I speak?" Crawford's eyebrows rose. "Mrs. Rowland, this is highly irregular. So is a man burning another man's property and then suing him for damages?" She met the judge's eyes without flinching. "I have evidence that establishes a pattern of harassment by Mr. Miller against my husband and others in this community. Evidence that shows these claims are part of a deliberate campaign to force us off our land." Miller shot to his feet. This is ridiculous. You're going to let some mail-order bride who arrived under false pretenses— Careful, Mr. Miller. Crawford's voice went cold. Mrs. Rowland is legally married and has every right to speak in defense of jointly owned property. And if you interrupt again, I'll hold you in contempt. He turned back to Evelyn. Present your evidence. Evelyn pulled out Mrs. Chen's records, purchases of fence wire, chemicals, lamp oil, all bought by Miller in quantities far exceeding what his ranch needed and always right before mysterious incidents on neighboring properties. She presented the dates, cross-referenced with Henderson's fence damage and the widow Morrison's poisoned well. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, Mr. Miller has been systematically terrorizing ranchers in this area for years. When people refuse to sell to him, he destroys their property and makes their lives impossible. The Henderson Ranch lost 50 head of cattle after fence breaks they couldn't explain. Mrs. Morrison had to dig a new well after hers was poisoned. And now he's trying the same tactics on us, only this time he's also using the court system to finish what arson started. These are wild accusations, Simmons sputtered. Unsubstantiated. I have witnesses. Evelyn cut him off. People who've experienced Miller's harassment firsthand and are willing to testify under oath. Crawford looked intrigued despite himself. Call your witnesses. Mrs. Chen went first. She testified about the suspicious purchases, the pattern of incidents, the way Miller had approached multiple ranchers with lowball offers right after disasters struck their properties. Her records were meticulous, her testimony calm and factual. John Henderson went next, describing the night his fences were cut and how Miller had appeared the next morning offering to buy his land at a fraction of its worth. His voice shook with anger held in check for 2 years. Alice Morrison's testimony was quieter but no less powerful. She described her husband's death, Miller's immediate pressure to sell, and the morning she'd discovered her well water was poisoned. I had 2 young children, she said, tears streaming down her face. He knew I couldn't afford to dig a new well. He was betting I'd have no choice but to sell to him or leave. But I stayed. I did the work myself by hand, and I kept my land. She looked directly at Miller. You tried to break me. You failed. The courtroom was dead silent. Crawford sat back, his expression unreadable. Mr. Miller, do you have any response to these accusations? Miller's face had gone purple. It's all lies. Bitter people trying to blame me for their own failures. Failures you engineered, Caleb said, standing beside Evelyn. Your Honor, the pattern is clear. Miller wants to own every ranch from here to the mountains. Anyone who won't sell faces harassment, sabotage, and now false legal claims. We're just the latest in a long line. You have no proof I did any of this. Miller slammed his hand on the table. It's all circumstantial. Is it? Evelyn pulled out one more document. This is a receipt from the feed store in Helena. Lamp oil, purchased by Frank Miller on the morning of September 13th. Our barn burned the night of September 14th. The fire marshal's report, which I obtained from the territorial office, states the fire was started with accelerant consistent with lamp oil. She laid the documents side by side on the judge's bench. Crawford studied them for a long moment, his expression darkening. Mr. Simmons, I strongly suggest you advise your client to reconsider his position. But Miller was beyond reason. This is a conspiracy. That woman is a fraud who came here under false pretenses, married Roland to steal his property. I married him to save his property, Evelyn said clearly. From you. Because you were going to take everything he built through lies and violence, and I refused to let that happen. You're nobody! Miller's control finally snapped completely. You're a cast-off, a second choice, a woman nobody wanted. I'm Mrs. Caleb Rowland, Evelyn interrupted, her voice ringing through the courtroom. And this ranch is as much mine as his, which means you can't intimidate just one person anymore. You have to go through both of us. And I promise you, Mr. Miller, I am far more stubborn than you anticipated. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Crawford banged his gavel. Order! I'll have order! When silence fell, he fixed Miller with a hard stare. Mr. Miller, I'm dismissing your claim with prejudice. Not only is there insufficient evidence to support your accusations, but the evidence presented by the defense suggests your claim was made in bad faith as part of a pattern of harassment. He paused. Furthermore, I'm ordering an investigation into the barn fire and the other incidents described in testimony today. If evidence of arson or property destruction is found, criminal charges will be filed. Miller went white. You can't. I can and I am. This court is adjourned. Crawford brought the gavel down with finality. The courtroom exploded into noise, people shouting, some cheering, Miller cursing as his lawyer tried to calm him. Evelyn stood frozen, barely processing that they'd won. Actually won. Caleb's hand found hers squeezing tight. When she looked at him, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "We did it," he said hoarsely. "We did." Mrs. Chen pushed through the crowd to embrace them both. "You stood up to him, actually stood up and won." Henderson clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "That took guts, both of you." Alice Morrison hugged Evelyn, whispering "thank you" over and over. But through the celebration, Evelyn could see Miller shoving his way toward the exit, his face twisted with rage. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and what she saw there chilled her blood. This wasn't over, not for him. They'd won the battle, but the war was just beginning. The ride home was quiet at first, both of them still processing what had happened. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold, and the land stretched out around them peaceful and unchanged, despite the fact that everything had changed. "He's not going to let this go," Caleb said finally. "You know that, right?" "I know." Evelyn watched the horizon. "But what can he do? The judge ordered an investigation. If he makes another move, he'll prove everything we said was true." "Men like Miller don't think that way. They think in terms of power and revenge." Caleb's jaw was tight. "We humiliated him in public, made him look weak. He'll come back twice as hard." "Then we'll be ready." Evelyn turned to face him. "Caleb, we can't live in fear of what he might do. We did the right thing. We told the truth. And we won. This time." "This time," she agreed. "And if there's a next time, we'll win again, together." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I don't know what I did to deserve you showing up on that train platform. You didn't do anything. I made a choice. We both did." She squeezed his hand. "And I'd make it again." The ranch came into view as the last light faded from the sky. Home. Not perfect, not safe, but theirs. Worth fighting for. They were putting the horses away when they heard riders approaching. Multiple horses, moving fast. Caleb immediately reached for the rifle, but Evelyn touched his arm. "Wait, look." 3 riders, but not threats. Mrs. Chen, Henderson, and Morrison, along with 2 other ranchers Evelyn didn't recognize. "Sorry to come unannounced," Henderson called out. "But we figured you might want company tonight, just in case Miller gets any ideas about retaliation." "We're staying," Mrs. Chen added, "taking shifts watching the property. He's not burning anything else." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "You don't have to." "Yes, we do," one of the unknown ranchers said. "You fought for all of us today. About time we returned the favor." They set up camp in the yard, building a fire and posting watches. Someone produced a bottle of whiskey, and soon there was music. Henderson had a harmonica, and one of the ranchers knew fiddle. It turned into an impromptu celebration, people laughing and talking, sharing stories of their own run-ins with Miller. Evelyn sat beside Caleb on the porch steps, watching the firelight play across friendly faces. For the first time since arriving in Montana, she didn't feel like an outsider. These people had accepted her, not despite her scandalous arrival, but because of what she'd done with it. "You're smiling," Caleb observed. "I'm happy." The realization surprised her. "Actually happy? Is that strange?" "After the day we've had? Probably." He bumped his shoulder against hers. "But I'm glad." They sat together as the night deepened, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest. Not just contentment, but belonging. She'd found a place where her stubbornness was valued, her practical nature was needed, her presence mattered. She'd found home. Around midnight, most of the visitors settled down to sleep, leaving Henderson on first watch. Evelyn and Caleb retreated to the house, both exhausted from the day's tension. At the door to her room, Evelyn paused. "Caleb?" He turned back. "Thank you for today, for standing with me, for—" She struggled to find the right words. For letting me be part of this fight instead of trying to protect me from it. You earned that right the day you ran into a burning barn. He smiled slightly. Besides, I'm starting to realize you don't need protecting. You're stronger than I am. That's not true. It is. You left everything you knew to come here, faced down Miller in court without flinching, built a place for yourself from nothing. His voice went soft. I just inherited land and stubbornness. You built yourself into someone worth knowing. Evelyn's breath caught. No one had ever said anything like that to her before. I think we're both stronger together, she managed. Yeah. Caleb's eyes held hers. We are. For a moment they stood in the dim hallway, and the air between them felt charged with something unnamed, something that went beyond partnership and practical arrangements. Then Caleb stepped back. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start rebuilding the barn. Together? Always. Evelyn went to bed with his words echoing in her mind. Always. It was a promise, but also a choice. Every day they chose this partnership, this life, each other. Not because they had to, but because they wanted to. She fell asleep with a smile on her face. The peace lasted 3 days. They worked on the barn with help from Henderson and the others, making real progress. The frame was going up, the structure taking shape. In the evenings, they'd eat together and plan the next day's work. Simple rhythms, honest labor, the satisfaction of building something with their own hands. On the 4th morning, Evelyn woke to the sound of Caleb cursing. She rushed outside to find him staring at the cattle pen. The gate was open, and the cattle, all of them, were gone. When did you last check them? Evelyn asked, her heart sinking. Last night before bed. They were all here. Caleb's face was pale. Someone came during the night, opened the gate, scattered them. Miller. Has to be, but proving it. We'll find them, Evelyn interrupted. She wouldn't let despair win. Not now. Get the horses. We'll track them down. They split up, Caleb heading west while Evelyn went north. She rode ash hard, scanning the horizon for any sign of the missing cattle. The sun climbed higher, and still nothing. Then she crested a ridge and saw them, at least 15 head bunched together in a ravine. And standing guard over them was one of Miller's ranch hands, the same one who'd testified in court. Evelyn's blood went cold. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was theft. She rode down carefully, keeping her hands visible. The ranch hand saw her coming and reached for his rifle. I wouldn't, Evelyn called out. Those are our cattle on our land. You're trespassing. This is Miller land now, the man said. You lost your cattle. We found them. Finders keepers. The boundary line is half a mile east. You know it. I know it. And more importantly, the law knows it. Evelyn kept her voice steady, despite the fear clawing at her throat. You can leave now, or I can ride back and return with the sheriff and witnesses. Your choice. The ranch hand's eyes narrowed. He was younger than Evelyn had thought, maybe 20, and clearly uncertain what to do. Whatever Miller had paid him, it probably wasn't enough to risk jail time. Miller's not going to like this, he said. Miller can take it up with Judge Crawford. Now move. For a tense moment, Evelyn thought he might actually shoot her. Then he lowered the rifle and backed toward his horse. You're making a mistake, lady. Miller always wins. Not this time. He rode off, and Evelyn let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, but she'd done it. Faced down an armed man and won through sheer stubbornness. It took her 2 hours to herd the cattle back toward the ranch. Caleb met her halfway, relief washing over his face when he saw her and the recovered animals. You found them. Where? In the ravine. Miller's man was guarding them, claiming they were on his land. Evelyn's voice was grim. They're not even pretending anymore. This was outright theft. We need to report this. Get the sheriff. And say what? That we found our cattle with Miller's man nearby? He'll just claim he was trying to help. Evelyn shook her head. We need proof. Real proof. Something undeniable. They got the cattle secured and spent the afternoon reinforcing the fence, adding locks to gates. But Evelyn's mind was working on a larger problem. Miller wasn't going to stop. The court loss had only made him more determined to destroy them. They needed to end this permanently. That night, Evelyn proposed her plan. We set a trap, she said. Miller keeps coming after our property, so we give him an opportunity he can't resist, and we catch him in the act." Caleb looked skeptical. "What kind of opportunity?" "We let it slip that we're taking the wagon to Helena for supplies. 2 days away. House empty, livestock unguarded." She met his eyes. "And when he makes his move, we're here waiting with witnesses." "That's dangerous. If it's Miller himself and not just his men, then we'll have him, actually have him, caught in the act with witnesses." Evelyn's voice was intense. "Caleb, we can't keep playing defense. We need to finish this." He studied her face for a long moment. "You know, if this goes wrong, someone could get hurt. Maybe us." "I know, but if we don't do something, Miller will keep coming until there's nothing left to defend." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I'm tired of being afraid, tired of waiting for the next attack. Let's end it." Caleb's fingers tightened around hers. "Together?" "Always." They spent the next 2 days preparing. Caleb spread word in town that they'd be leaving for Helena, making sure it would get back to Miller. Henderson and Morrison agreed to hide in the barn with the sheriff, waiting to see if Miller took the bait. On the appointed night, Caleb and Evelyn made a show of loading the wagon and leaving. But a mile down the road, they circled back, approaching the ranch on foot through the darkness. The house was dark. The newly rebuilt barn was a shadow against the sky. Everything looked peaceful. They waited in the tree line with Henderson, Morrison, and Sheriff Davies, a hard-eyed man who'd been skeptical of the plan but willing to give it a chance. "If nobody shows, we look like fools," Davies muttered. "Someone will show," Evelyn whispered back. An hour passed, then 2. Evelyn was starting to think she'd been wrong when she heard it. Horses, approaching from the east. 3 riders, moving cautiously. Through the darkness, she could make out Frank Miller himself, flanked by 2 of his men. They dismounted near the barn, and even from a distance, Evelyn could see Miller gesturing, giving orders. One of the men pulled out a can, lamp oil, judging by the way he handled it. "Now," Davies said quietly. They moved as one, stepping out from concealment with rifles ready. Davies called out, "Frank Miller, you're under arrest for attempted arson and trespassing." Miller spun, his face going white in the moonlight. For a second, Evelyn thought he might run. Then his expression hardened into rage. "You!" He stared at Evelyn with pure hatred. "You set this up." "I gave you an opportunity to incriminate yourself," Evelyn corrected. "You took it. That's on you. You think this changes anything? You think—" "I think you're finished," Caleb cut him off. "We have witnesses. We have you caught in the act. And this time, there's no talking your way out." Davies moved forward with handcuffs while Henderson and Morrison kept rifles trained on Miller's men. The fight went out of Miller all at once, his shoulders slumping in defeat. As Davies led him away, Miller looked back at Evelyn one last time. "It should have worked. You were nobody. You shouldn't have mattered." "But I did," Evelyn said quietly. "That's what you never understood. We all matter. Every person you tried to break, every ranch you tried to steal. We all mattered, and together we were stronger than you." Miller had no response to that. Davies loaded him into a wagon, and they all watched as the man who'd terrorized the territory for years was finally taken away to face justice. When the wagon disappeared into the darkness, Evelyn felt Caleb's arm come around her shoulders. "It's over," he said wonderingly. "It's actually over." "It is." Evelyn leaned into him, letting the tension drain from her body. "We won. Really, truly won." They stood together in the quiet night, surrounded by friends who'd risked their own safety to help them. The ranch was safe. Their future was secure. And somewhere in the fight, in the choosing each other day after day, they'd built something neither of them had expected. Not just a partnership, not just mutual respect, something deeper, something real, something that felt remarkably like home. The weeks following Miller's arrest brought changes that rippled through the territory like stones thrown into still water. The Miller Ranch was seized by the territorial government after the investigation uncovered years of fraud, theft, and intimidation. The land was divided and sold to the very people Miller had tried to destroy. Henderson bought the eastern section, the widow Morrison claimed the southern pastures, and 3 other families who'd suffered under Miller's schemes each took parcels at fair prices. Justice, served cold and complete. For Caleb and Evelyn, life settled into a rhythm that felt almost surreal after months of crisis. The barn was finished by mid-November, solid and weather-tight with a new loft full of hay for winter. The cattle were fat and healthy, the fences stood strong, and every morning Evelyn woke to the realization that she was safe, that the fight was over, that this life she'd built was actually hers to keep. But something else was changing too, something harder to name. It started with small things. The way Caleb's hand would linger on hers when he helped her down from the wagon. The way she'd catch him watching her across the dinner table with an expression that went beyond partnership. The way they'd both started finding excuses to stay up late together, talking by lamplight about things that had nothing to do with ranching or survival. They were still sleeping in separate rooms, still maintaining the careful boundaries they'd established. But those boundaries were wearing thin, and they both knew it. On a cold December morning, Evelyn was kneading bread when Caleb came in from checking the cattle, his face flushed from the wind. "Snow's coming," he said, shaking ice from his coat. "Big storm, probably tonight. We should bring in extra wood." "I'll help." Evelyn wiped flour from her hands. "You don't have to. I can—" "Caleb," she turned to face him. "We've been through this. I'm not a guest here. I'm your wife, your partner. Stop trying to protect me from work." Something shifted in his expression. "Is that what I'm doing?" "You know you are. Ever since Miller was arrested, you've been treating me like I might break." She crossed her arms. "I won't break. I didn't break when I got on that train. I didn't break when the barn burned. I didn't break when Miller's man had a rifle pointed at me. So stop acting like hard work is going to do what all of that couldn't." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he moved closer, and there was something in his eyes that made Evelyn's breath catch. "That's not why I'm trying to spare you the heavy work," he said quietly. "I'm not worried you'll break. I know better than that." "Then why?" "Because I don't want you to have to." His voice went rough. "Because you've spent your whole life doing work that should have been shared. Because you deserve—" He stopped, struggling with words. "Because I want to give you something better than survival." Evelyn's throat tightened. "I don't need better, Caleb. I need this. Real work, shared purpose, knowing I'm actually contributing." "You contribute by existing," he interrupted. "By being here. By choosing this life when you could have chosen anything else." "I chose you," she corrected softly. The life came with it. The silence that fell was different from their usual comfortable quiet. This was charged, heavy with things they'd both been avoiding for weeks. Caleb reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. When she didn't, his hand cupped her cheek, calloused thumb brushing across her skin. "Evelyn," he said, and her name on his lips sounded like a question and an answer at once. "This arrangement we made, the 1-year trial, do you still want that out?" Her heart hammered against her ribs. "Do you?" "No." The word came immediate and certain. "I don't want an exit. I don't want temporary. I want—" He stopped, his eyes searching hers. "I want this to be real. Not just legal, not just practical. Real." Evelyn's breath shook. "It already is real. It's been real since—" She didn't get to finish because Caleb kissed her. Not the brief perfunctory kiss from their wedding. This was real, deep and desperate, and full of months of held-back feeling. His hands tangled in her hair, and she gripped his shoulders, and for a moment, the whole world narrowed to just this, just them, just the truth they'd both been too afraid to speak. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caleb pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you," he said hoarsely. "I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first day when you asked for 3 months instead of running. Maybe when you ran into that burning barn. Maybe it's been growing this whole time and I was too stubborn to see it. But I love you, Evelyn, not because you're useful or practical or convenient, because you're you." Tears spilled down Evelyn's cheeks. "I love you too. I've been so afraid to say it because I thought if I admitted it, you'd realize I was breaking our agreement, that I was making this complicated when it was supposed to be simple." "Nothing about us has ever been simple." Caleb brushed away her tears with gentle fingers. "But it's been real from the start. We just needed time to catch up to what we were building." Evelyn laughed through her tears. "We're terrible at this, at romance, at saying what we feel." We're good at other things. Building, fighting, surviving. He smiled. We can learn the rest. Together? Always. They stood in the kitchen holding each other while the bread dough rose forgotten on the counter and the wind picked up outside, carrying the promise of snow. And for the first time since Evelyn had stepped off that train, she felt complete. Not because she'd found someone to save her, but because she'd found someone who saw her as an equal. Someone who valued her strength instead of fearing it. Someone who chose her not despite her practicality, but because of it. Someone who loved her exactly as she was. That night, the storm hit with fury that rattled the windows and piled snow against the door. They sat together by the fire, Caleb's arm around Evelyn's shoulders, watching the flames dance while the wind howled outside. "Tell me about your mother," Evelyn said quietly. "The real story. Not just that she died." Caleb was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed, a long breath that seemed to carry years of grief. "She was strong, like you. Came out here when this was barely civilized territory, followed my father because she loved him." His voice was distant, remembering. "My father was a dreamer. Always had grand plans that never quite worked out. The ranch was supposed to make us rich. Never did. She worked herself to exhaustion trying to make his dreams real, and when he died in a riding accident, she just stopped. Like all the fight went out of her." "How old were you?" 17. My brother was 15. We tried to keep things going, but she'd given up. Stopped eating properly, stopped caring about the ranch, stopped caring about anything. 6 months after my father died, she followed him." His jaw tightened. "The doctor said it was pneumonia, but I knew better. She died because she didn't want to live without him." Evelyn's heart ached for the boy he'd been, watching his mother fade away. "That's why you wanted a practical arrangement. No grand passion that could destroy you." "Yeah." He looked at her. "But I was wrong about something. I thought love and partnership were opposites. That you could have one or the other, but not both. My mother loved my father, but they weren't partners. He made decisions, she followed, he dreamed, she worked. It wasn't equal. And now I know you can have both, love and partnership, because that's what we have." His hand found hers. "You're my equal, Evelyn. My choice. My partner. And somehow, without meaning to, you became the person I can't imagine living without. But it's different than what my parents had. Because if something happened to me, you'd survive. You'd grieve, but you'd keep going. You're strong enough to stand alone." "I am," Evelyn agreed. "But I'd rather stand with you." He pulled her closer, and they sat together watching the storm rage outside their walls. Safe. Together. Home. The winter months brought a different kind of work, maintenance and planning rather than frantic survival. They spent long evenings going over the ranch accounts, making plans for spring. Caleb wanted to expand the cattle operation. Evelyn suggested diversifying, maybe adding chickens or pigs, crops that could sell in town. "You're thinking like a businesswoman," Caleb observed one night. "I'm thinking like someone who grew up watching money disappear and wants to make sure it never happens here." She made a note in the ledger. "We need multiple income sources. Can't rely just on cattle. Practical as always. Someone has to be." But she was smiling when she said it. They worked together like they'd been doing it for years instead of months. Caleb would start a thought, and Evelyn would finish it. She'd have an idea, and he'd immediately see how to implement it. They complemented each other in ways that went beyond compatibility into something almost uncanny. Henderson visited in January, bringing news that Miller had been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison for arson and attempted theft. "Judge threw the book at him," Henderson reported. "Said he'd been terrorizing honest people long enough." "Good," Evelyn said simply. She felt no triumph, just relief. Justice, finally served. Henderson looked between them, noticing how they stood close together, how Caleb's hand rested naturally on Evelyn's waist. "You two look different, happier." "We are," Caleb said. He met Evelyn's eyes and smiled. "Turns out marrying for practical reasons doesn't mean you can't fall in love along the way." "About time you figured that out." Henderson clapped Caleb on the shoulder. "The whole territory's been watching you two dance around each other. We had bets on when you'd finally admit it." Evelyn laughed. "Who won?" Mrs. Chen, she said you'd sort yourselves out by Christmas. Woman has an eye for these things. They celebrated with whiskey and stories, and when Henderson finally left, Evelyn felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the alcohol. This was her community now. These people who'd helped them fight Miller, who'd stood witness to their marriage, who celebrated their happiness like it was their own. She belonged here, not by accident or necessity, but by choice and earned respect. February brought a late storm that trapped them inside for 3 days. They played cards by lamplight, argued good-naturedly about whether to expand the chicken coop, and talked about everything and nothing. On the third night, Caleb pulled out an old trunk from under his bed. "I want to show you something," he said. Inside were letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age. His mother's correspondence with friends back east, documenting her life on the frontier. "Read them," Caleb urged. She wrote about the loneliness, the work, but also the joy, the satisfaction of building something real. I think you'd understand her better than anyone. Evelyn read late into the night, discovering a woman who was more complex than Caleb's grief-tinged memories suggested. Yes, she'd loved her husband deeply, but she'd also loved the land, the challenge, the accomplishment of making a home in wilderness. Her letters spoke of pride in her work, satisfaction in her strength, moments of pure joy at sunrise over the mountains or a successful harvest. She'd been more than just a woman who'd loved too much. She'd been whole. "She would have liked you," Evelyn said, closing the last letter. "I think she would have recognized something of herself in what we're building." "A partnership," Caleb said, "based on choice and respect." "Based on love," Evelyn corrected. "But love that makes us stronger, not weaker." He kissed her then, gentle and sure. And later, when the storm finally broke and they stood together watching dawn paint the snow gold, Evelyn realized she'd stopped thinking of this as a temporary arrangement months ago. Somewhere between the barn burning and the courtroom victory, between learning to ride and learning to fight, this had become her life. Not the life she'd expected. Better. Spring arrived with the rush of meltwater and the first green shoots pushing through winter-dead grass. They planted the garden together, Evelyn directing while Caleb dug. The rhythm of shared work had become second nature. She'd gesture, he'd understand. He'd start a sentence, she'd finish it. Mrs. Chen visited in April, ostensibly to bring seeds, but really to check on them. She took one look at their faces and smiled. "You two figured it out," she said approvingly. "Figured what out?" Evelyn asked innocently. "That the wrong bride was exactly right." Mrs. Chen handed over the seeds. "I knew it the day you faced down Miller in my store. The kind of woman who does that. She doesn't settle for convenience. She builds something real." "We're trying," Evelyn admitted. "You're succeeding. I can see it in how you move around each other, like you've been married for decades instead of months." After she left, Caleb pulled Evelyn close. "The wrong bride, huh?" "I suppose I was. I wasn't Margaret. Wasn't what you ordered. You were exactly what I needed. I was just too stubborn to see it at first." He kissed her forehead. "Best mistake that ever happened to me." Technically, it was Margaret's mistake. She's the one who fell in love with that clerk. "Then I owe her a debt of gratitude. If she'd shown up instead of you," Caleb shook his head, "I would have had exactly what I asked for and none of what I actually needed." Evelyn thought about that as they worked through the spring days. All her life, she'd been the practical one, the overlooked daughter, the woman who cleaned up other people's messes. She'd come to Montana expecting more of the same, work off the debt, disappear into usefulness, maybe earn a place through sheer stubborn utility. Instead, she'd found someone who valued her not despite her strength, but because of it. Someone who saw her practicality as a gift, not a flaw. Someone who chose her deliberately every single day. The wrong woman turned out to be exactly right. By June, the ranch was thriving. The cattle were healthy, the garden was producing, and they'd added chickens and pigs just as Evelyn had suggested. Money wasn't abundant, but it was steady. They were building something sustainable, something that would last. One evening, Caleb found Evelyn on the porch watching the sunset. He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous pastime." He smiled. "About what you said." That day in the kitchen when I asked about the 1-year trial, you said it was already real. It was. It is. When did you know? His voice was curious, not demanding. When did this stop being an arrangement and become something more? Evelyn considered. I don't think there was one moment. It was gradual, like spring coming. You don't notice the exact day winter ends. You just wake up one morning and realize everything's green. She turned to look at him. But if I had to choose a moment, maybe it was when you ran into that burning barn after me. Not because you were trying to be heroic, but because you were genuinely terrified I'd die. Like my life actually mattered to you beyond what I could do for the ranch. Your life mattered from the day you arrived. Caleb's voice was rough. I was just too scared to admit how much. And for you? When did you know? He was quiet for a moment. The courtroom. When you stood up to Miller and called yourself my equal. You weren't playing a role or pretending to be what I needed. You were just you. Strong and stubborn and completely unafraid. And I realized I didn't just need you. I wanted you, wanted this, wanted everything we were building together. Evelyn threaded her fingers through his. We've built something good here, haven't we? Better than good. Better than I dreamed was possible. He squeezed her hand. I spent so many years thinking practical and passionate were opposites. That you could have a sensible partnership or you could have love, but not both. You proved me wrong. We proved us wrong, Evelyn corrected. I thought the same thing, that accepting practical meant giving up on ever being someone's first choice, that being valued for my usefulness was the best I could hope for. She looked at their joined hands. But you chose me, not because I was useful, though I am, but because of who I am. The practical woman who ran into a burning barn, who negotiated with Miller, who refused to back down. The woman I love, Caleb said simply. Not despite your strength, because of it. They sat together as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. The ranch spread out before them, their land, their home, their shared future. It wasn't perfect. The work was hard, money was always tight, and there would be more challenges ahead. But they'd face those together, the way they'd faced everything else. With honesty, with respect, with love that had grown from partnership into something deeper and more lasting than mere passion. In July, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. The realization came slowly. Subtle signs she'd almost missed. When she was finally certain, she sat with the knowledge for a day before telling Caleb, trying to process what it meant. A child. An actual child. Born into this life they'd built. She found him in the barn, mending tack in the late afternoon light. He looked up when she entered, and something in her expression made him set down his work. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Everything's... She stopped, took a breath. Caleb, I'm pregnant. He went completely still. You're sure? Yes. The silence stretched. Evelyn's heart hammered. They'd never discussed children. The marriage had been practical, then it had been real, but they'd never talked about expanding their family. What if he didn't want this? What if... Caleb crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something precious and fragile and utterly vital. A baby, he said against her hair. His voice shook. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy? Evelyn asked, needing to hear it. He pulled back enough to cup her face, and his eyes were bright with tears. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. Terrified, yes. Overwhelmed, absolutely, but happy. Evelyn, you've given me everything I never knew I needed, and now, his voice broke. Now we're building a family. An actual family. She kissed him, tasting salt from tears, his or hers she couldn't tell. When they finally separated, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. This wasn't part of the plan, Evelyn said. The best things never are. Caleb's hand moved to her still flat stomach, gentle and wondering. 3 months. That's all you asked for. 3 months to work off a debt, and instead you gave me a lifetime. We gave each other a lifetime, Evelyn corrected. I got just as much as I gave. They stood together in the barn, holding each other, planning for a future that had once seemed impossible. A child who would grow up knowing both parents chose to be there. who would be raised in a home built on partnership and respect, who would see what real love looked like. Not the destructive passion that had broken Caleb's mother, but something steadier and stronger. Love that was chosen daily. Love that was earned and given freely. Love that made them both better. The pregnancy progressed through the summer and into fall. Evelyn refused to slow down despite Caleb's hovering, insisting she was perfectly capable of her normal work. They argued about it good-naturedly, her stubbornness meeting his protectiveness in debates that always ended in compromise. "I'm not fragile," she'd say. "I know, but you're carrying our child. Let me help." "You are helping, by not treating me like I'll shatter." They'd work together, finding the balance between Evelyn's need to be useful and Caleb's desire to ease her burden. It was partnership in its purest form, neither controlling, neither submissive, both equal. Mrs. Chen visited regularly, bringing herbs and advice. Henderson and Morrison checked in weekly. The community that had rallied to help them fight Miller now rallied to support the growing family. In this harsh land where survival required cooperation, Evelyn had found not just a home, but a place where she belonged completely. In late January, exactly 1 year after Evelyn had stepped off that train, their daughter was born. The labor was long and difficult, attended by Mrs. Chen and Alice Morrison. Caleb paced outside, helpless and terrified, until Mrs. Chen finally called him in to meet his daughter. She was tiny, red-faced, perfect. When Caleb held her for the first time, his hands shook. "She's so small," he whispered. "She'll grow," Evelyn said from the bed, exhausted but smiling. "We'll teach her to be strong, like her father, practical, like her mother." "What should we name her?" Evelyn had been thinking about this for months. "Grace, because that's what brought me here. Not my planning or my sister's mistake, but grace. The unearned gift of finding exactly what I needed when I was looking for something else entirely." Caleb kissed his daughter's forehead, then Evelyn's. Grace Rowland. Perfect. They sat together as the winter sun set, 3 people where there had been 2. A family, built from a mistake that had turned into destiny. The years that followed brought their own challenges. Drought one summer, harsh winter the next, the constant work of maintaining a ranch and raising a child. But they faced everything together, Caleb and Evelyn, partners in every sense. Grace grew into a strong, curious child who followed her mother around the ranch, asking endless questions, and helped her father with the cattle as soon as she was old enough to sit a horse. She had Evelyn's practicality and Caleb's quiet determination, and watching her grow felt like witnessing the best parts of both of them made new. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Caleb gave Evelyn a gift, a frame containing the telegram that had started everything, the one asking for Margaret Harper, the bride who was supposed to arrive. "Why?" Evelyn asked, puzzled. "Because I want to remember where we started, how close I came to getting exactly what I asked for and missing what I actually needed." He pulled her close. "You were the wrong woman according to that telegram. Wrong name, wrong expectations, wrong everything. But you were exactly right for me." Evelyn looked at the telegram, thinking about that terrified woman who'd stepped off the train carrying her sister's debt and her own desperate hope for somewhere to belong. She'd expected 3 months of hard work and then nothing. Disappearance into another invisible role. Instead, she'd found partnership, love, purpose, a home built on honesty and mutual respect, a family that chose each other every day. "I was so scared," she admitted. "That day on the platform. I thought you'd put me back on the train. Thought I'd have nowhere left to go. Best thing I ever did was say yes, giving you those 3 months. Best thing I ever did was ask." She leaned into him. "Not just for the 3 months, but for all of it. The partnership, the marriage, the life we built." They stood together on their porch, watching Grace play in the yard, the ranch thriving around them. The wrong bride and the lonely rancher who'd found in each other exactly what they needed. Not rescue, not salvation, just partnership, respect. Love that grew from working side by side, from choosing each other when either could have walked away, from building something real out of a mistake that had turned into the best decision either of them had ever made. 10 years after Evelyn stepped off that train, she stood in the same spot with Caleb beside her, watching another family arrive, newcomers to the territory looking for their own fresh start. "Think they'll make it?" Caleb asked. "If they're willing to work, if they're honest with each other, if they remember that the best things are built, not found." Evelyn squeezed his hand. "Like we did. Like we're still doing." Because that was the truth of it. Their story hadn't ended when Miller was defeated or when Grace was born. It continued every day in small choices and shared work, in morning coffee and evening planning sessions, in arguments resolved through compromise and challenges faced together. They'd built something that lasted, not because it was easy, nothing about their life was easy, but because they'd chosen it, chosen each other, built a foundation on truth instead of fantasy, on partnership instead of dependence, on love that was as practical as it was profound. The wrong woman had become the right wife. The mail order mistake had become destiny. And two people who'd married for the most practical of reasons had discovered that practical could also mean perfect. Their story was simple in the end. Two people who needed each other, found each other, and chose each other. Every single day. Together. Always together. And that was more than enough. It was everything.